it's Adam from Champion Briefs, and I'll be giving the topic analysis for Resolved States Ought to Eliminate Their Nuclear Arsenals, which is the January-February 2020 Lincoln Douglas resolution. So, Happy New Year. But more importantly, this topic has a lot of great arguments on both sides. I think it's one of the most expansive topics that LD has had in a while. I actually debated it when I was in 8th grade back in 2011, where the topic was Resolved States Ought Not Possess Nuclear Weapons, which was the September-October topic at the time. And now it's come back, and I think that it, for a variety of reasons, deserves to re-enter the conversation. We have a lot of excellent cards in our brief from Champion Briefs, and I encourage you to check it out so that you'll have literature to be prepared for both sides of this topic. So what I'm going to do is briefly summarize the most important aspects of the literature and then also get into important affirmative and negative positions that you'll need to be knowledgeable of if you don't prepare them yourself. Of course, there's a lot of room for innovation, but the value of a stock argument is that it's stock for a reason, because there's so much literature that underlies it, which means when you look at these arguments, you should be thinking about not just, oh, how many people know about this position, but also, what's the literature like that actually supports it? And this topic is excellent because there's so much literature, again, that supports each of these positions and also criticisms of them on both sides. So in terms of introducing the topic, so there are 9 nuclear weapons states today. Those are the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, China, France, North Korea, India, Pakistan, and Israel. Whereas the first 8 nuclear states are unabashedly in possession of them. Israel maintains a policy of opacity, so they neither confirm nor deny that they possess nuclear weapons, but there's widespread evidence that they've engaged in nuclear testing and have possessed nuclear weapons since the Six-Day War in 1967. So for the purposes of the topic, they do belong into that conversation of nuclear weapons states and of disarmament. The only time nuclear weapons have ever been used was by the United States, which dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, which is credited with ending World War II. That debate itself is historically ambiguous, given that there are valid historical critiques, both of the idea that nuclear weapons in that situation were necessary to prevent a major land invasion by the United States that may have definitely resulted in lots of casualties, whether more casualties is a conversation, but also the idea that unconditional surrender from Japan was necessary in order to win that war, because Japan's refusal to unconditionally surrender and for their emperor to step down was ultimately why the United States felt it had to resort to these drastic measures that many have said since then were inhumane, even with literature written in the aftermath, such as the book Hiroshima by John Hersey. But that historical event is definitely an important facet of the topic, because if we think about the tens and hundreds of thousands of people that died in that scenario, we also have to consider that some nuclear weapons today are 3,000 times more powerful, at least, than the A-bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that's according to popular mechanics, which is why when people today say that nuclear weapons possessed primarily by the United States and Russia, who have 92% of the world's nuclear weapons, each with over 6,000 amongst them, could blow up the world multiple times over. And that's because nuclear weapons are the most destructive weapons that have ever been invented by humanity. And ultimately, that means that they not only risk the casualties today of millions of people, but also could risk human extinction. And I think it's worth understanding why it is that we say that nuclear war leads to human extinction, which is a commonplace in debate today, and that's because of the thesis of nuclear winter. So the idea is that nuclear weapons would release so much smoke into the air as a result of an enormous blast that would immediately kill people and then also cause radiation, but all of the soot that rises up into the atmosphere could block out the sun, which would shut down global agriculture and lead to mass starvation, and then the earth would be a wasteland that gets significantly depopulated and would kill us all. So that's ultimately why many fear that nuclear weapons are an apocalyptic weapon. But there are others that say that nuclear weapons have been the greatest device of peace in terms of their ability to prevent another world war from ever taking place again, because the idea is that if nuclear weapons exist, and we all know how terrible they are, that countries won't want to risk being too aggressive or actually starting a major war on par with what we saw in World War I and World War II, because nuclear weapons would then get used in desperation or in a crisis, and that would mean global suicide. So there's a huge debate here as to whether having nuclear weapons at all makes it likely that they'll get used regardless of the scenario, whether it's an accident or whether it's a country acting especially aggressive toward another, or them perceiving that they have to use nuclear weapons first because another country might eliminate their own nuclear arsenals and get the jump on an enemy. So that's the use it or lose it pressure. All of these factors, even the extent that nuclear missiles are becoming more precise and with lower yields, they could become targeted toward a battlefield and certainly cause lots of damage, but not be equivalent to this global mushroom cloud scenario. All of that enters the debate as to whether nuclear weapons, as we've readied them to be used, would make the ultimate unthinkable scenario more likely, versus those who say that actually, with the thesis of mutually assured destruction, that over history, countries have realized that no matter what their interests or agendas are, it is never wise for them to risk a nuclear war, which means that all of the buildup we're seeing today is just them strengthening that deterrence mechanism and creating further conditions of global peace. So that's really where the debate lies, at least from a consequentialist perspective of looking at the security implications of using nuclear weapons. It's also worth looking at how international law has played into the discussion about nuclear weapons as well. There's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was signed by multiple countries in 1970, and it was extended indefinitely in the 1990s. This included both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, with the intention by nuclear powers at the time to convince countries that didn't already have nuclear weapons that they should not develop them. And the reason those non-nuclear states agreed to this is because of what the nuclear powers acceded to in Article 5 of the treaty, that says that they would make good faith efforts toward nuclear disarmament, which means, in plain language, that eventually these nuclear powers would abolish their arsenals. However, that hasn't really happened. And there are fears now that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty could unravel based upon the alleged double standards that nuclear powers are professing. There's also the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, or CTBT, which has not been ratified yet by the United States, but the objective of that treaty is to ban nuclear testing. So it is possible to maintain nuclear arsenals without testing new types of nuclear weapons, and certainly the CTBT would limit any future nuclear weapons modernization, but at the same time, many believe that this would halt a future arms race and mean that current nuclear weapons that we know work would still be operational. More recently, and I think this is why the nuclear weapons topic has re-entered the debate circuit, is because of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW. In 2017, this was signed by 34 parties, none of which were nuclear weapons states, but it was ratified then by those 34 countries. The difference between signed and ratified is you have diplomats that sign it, and then you have legislatures in each of the countries actually confirming that they'll adopt the treaty. So 34 states have ratified it. And when I say states, by the way, I mean countries. I do not mean states like in the United States. So the topic is not about whether Texas or Massachusetts should have nuclear weapons, but the reason international law is important is because the technical term for a country is a state, as in the state makes a decision on behalf of its populace. So think of it in terms of governments that possess nuclear weapons. But anyway, the TPNW is a significant force in international law, not because it's actually influenced the behavior of nuclear weapon states, but because it's got the attention even of organizations like NATO, who have claimed that the TPNW would undermine the ability of that organization to achieve extended deterrence, where countries like the United States or the UK or France, which are NATO countries, are able to use nuclear weapons to dissuade countries like Russia or China from engaging in aggressive behavior. So, nuclear weapons are a multifaceted debate, and often these treaties are the locus of which for which that debate occurs. Even with the NPT, it's notable that North Korea withdrew from the treaty in 2003 to develop its nuclear program, and India and Pakistan are not parties to the NPT either. Those three countries that I've mentioned are also focal points because many believe that a nuclear war between India and Pakistan could escalate over their territorial conflicts in the contested Kashmir region. India and Pakistan share a border, and they each claim ownership of parts or the whole of the Kashmir area, and it is possible that in a conventional war between India and Pakistan, say India invades Pakistan, that Pakistan may resort to using nuclear weapons in order to overcome what they perceive as India's conventional superiority. And if you look at news publications, either from Pakistani websites or Indian websites, you'll definitely get different perspectives as to who's ultimately the aggressor state and who needs nuclear weapons in that scenario to deter. But both countries have, aside from fighting three conventional wars since having nuclear weapons, are also engaged in certain forms of diplomacy to diffuse tensions and potentially work toward, at some point in the future, a nuclear-free region. So you could say even that with all of these tensions taking place in the region and the wars that they've fought, the fact that nuclear war hadn't occurred yet is not because we were lucky, but maybe because there is some truth to the deterrence thesis. But you'll find in our brief a lot of excellent cards that really look at the upsides and downsides of a nuclear deterrence policy and whether history bears out that it has succeeded. Whereas others may say that the reason we haven't seen a World War III is because of factors like democracy. As more countries become democracies, they're less likely to actually go to war because they share similar values and they trade with each other, or generally the fact that as free trade has extended across the world, that's made war less likely because countries don't want to go to war with people where their businesses are making money, because if you attack a country that you're trading with, then your economy will suffer. So those two theses of democratic peace and economic interdependence are also other factors for the affirmative to consider. So I will briefly summarize kind of 6 areas of the topic that are worth looking at for affirmative and negative positions. So the first area would be Kantianism. So there are a variety of authors that have written about the immorality of nuclear deterrence based on the principle of the categorical imperative, the idea that human beings must not be treated as a mere means to another person or government's ends. And the idea is that a nuclear deterrence policy, in threatening to use nuclear weapons against an enemy state's cities or infrastructure, is treating innocent civilians as a mere means to the ends of our foreign policy in a way that's different from conventional conflict, because in conventional wars you have international laws that dictate how you're supposed to treat combatants and non-combatants, and there isn't the same indiscriminate and disproportionate threat to an entire body of civilians within, say, the capital city of an enemy state. So that means, therefore, that even if nuclear weapons never get used, the threat of them via a deterrence policy is immoral. There are others within the just war theory tradition, such as Michael Walzer, who in Just and Unjust Wars said that even though the threat to use nuclear weapons may be evil, if deterrence is true, then it is better to threaten evil so that it never takes place. So you could say that even though the affirmative is right about the intention of using nuclear weapons being problematic, that the credible threat of using them is actually what dissuades countries from taking that option in the first place. So this is Kantian or non-consequentialist because it's not so much about the ultimate consequence for human well-being if nuclear weapons are used, but rather that innocent civilians are being taken hostage, as the literature calls it. And it's hostage taking because these civilians are being dangled over the heads of the leaders of another state, claiming that they will be destroyed if a country does certain things. So the second case to look at, or framework, would be that of realism. So this is the theory of international relations that comes from John Mearsheimer, who argues that states in a world that does not have a stable or consistent international order, because there's no world government that provides security for all states, and international laws are frequently violated by countries. States have to rely on themselves for their own security, and they cannot actually verify the intentions of other states, which means they constantly have to be on the lookout for preventing conflict, and also as there are rising powers and status quo dominant powers, they'll inevitably clash and try to achieve dominance within the regions, and therefore there will be conflict. But Mearsheimer believes that if a state can achieve overwhelming superiority, that can deter another country from actually going after it. So there are realists who argue that nuclear weapons ensure the peace because of deterrence, and also because a country with nuclear weapons can achieve a kind of military superiority in a way that conventional options cannot. Where a country would never want to contemplate actually invading a state that has nuclear weapons. And there's a whole debate about whether the conventional wars that have happened since the advent of nuclear weapons confirm or deny this thesis. There is some recent scholarship that says that while conventional wars that have taken place demonstrate that nuclear weapons have limited offensive value as a tool of coercive diplomacy, whereas somebody can say that we'll use nuclear weapons if you engage in XYZ actions toward another country, not even themselves using nuclear weapons, and therefore threatening retaliation. But countries are able to call the bluff of those that use nuclear weapons as a trump card, pun intended, because many say that Donald Trump is so erratic that norms of rationality within the discussion about deterrence would not apply to him. But nonetheless, countries have called the bluff of nuclear powers and engaged in their prerogatives anyway. But the same scholarship has said that nuclear deterrence still has utility as a defensive mechanism of preventing invasion or of preventing nuclear weapons from ever being used. So this can be used on both sides as well, because what I've described here is offensive realism, but the affirmative can pursue a framework of defensive realism and argue that actually states don't want to rock the boat, and for the sake of their security, they want to maintain the world as it is, and therefore that means that they would agree to global disarmament because they would believe that it's a win-win scenario where countries can avoid the chance of global suicide, and also countries that agree to global nuclear abolition or global zero can maintain the positions that they already have, like they can maintain trade, they can prevent other countries from aggressing against them, etc. When it comes to the utilitarian side of things, so maximizing good consequences, minimizing suffering, etc., there are a variety of different impacts that you can pursue, such as inadvertent nuclear launch or accidents, nuclear terrorism, whether it's terrorist groups that steal nuclear bombs or the material and get scientists to make them and then they launch them. There's the question of nuclear proliferation. So if countries have nuclear weapons now, that's going to motivate even more countries to get nuclear weapons. And does that make the world more or less stable? There was a really famous debate about that between political scientists Scott Sagan and Kenneth Waltz. Kenneth Waltz was even famous for arguing that Iran should also be able to get a nuclear bomb because it would make the Middle East even more stable. But the reason there was an Iran nuclear deal in 2015 was because the Obama administration believed that Iran having nuclear weapons would make the world less stable, and Trump has just scrapped that deal, so Iran is getting closer to developing a nuclear weapon now. There's the question of escalation as countries like the US and Russia and US and China continue to fight one another over various issues, not in a war, but in terms of disputes and how those could escalate to nuclear conflict in terms of deliberate launch or in terms of misperceiving the other side's intentions. There are questions about the environment in terms of the impacts of nuclear weapons testing on indigenous communities and also on the biodiversity of the planet in terms of marine life, in terms of radiation affecting other ecosystems. And the question of indigenous people being harmed by nuclear testing is also separate from the question of the environment, because that would apply to the thesis of environmental justice in terms of how polluting activities are disproportionately cited in marginalized communities of color, and nuclear weapons are an extension of that. There are also questions, however, about the environmental cleanup costs of dismantling nuclear arsenals were states to eliminate them, and how that may also create some problems for contamination of land, water, and air. There's the question of deterrence, which I've again described. There's finally an argument about how countries will shift to other types of weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, in a scenario where they can't access nuclear weapons. In our brief, we have a variety of cards talking about the extent that chemical or biological weapons that use pathogens as a means of warfare might be adopted more widely. Of course, there is a chemical weapons convention that since the 60s has prohibited states from adopting CBWs, but Syria, despite being an adoptee of the Chemical Weapons Convention, has used chemical weapons against its own population in the Syrian civil war, so it's very possible that countries could abrogate the CWC as a result of nuclear abolition. There's also the question of rearmament. So there's the thesis that comes from Thomas Schelling and others who say that nuclear weapons can't be uninvented. Pandora's box has been opened, and once states agree to the global elimination of nuclear weapons, they're going to maintain secret programs, and then once they perceive that other countries are doing the same in the middle of a conventional war, they're going to take advantage of their latent nuclear capacity. So the fact they'll still have labs, they'll still have scientists, they'll still have material, and quickly develop nuclear weapons and then use them. And that could cause global instability, human extinction, etc. Because the norms of mutual deterrence, where 9 countries have nuclear weapons and are all watching each other around the clock, would no longer be a norm that exists in the international sphere. So there'd be asymmetries where then only 1 or 2 states have nuclear weapons and are threatening others, and they get used in a tense situation, which is why the affirmative has to talk about the ability to verify a global disarmament regime, to ensure that there are international inspectors that prevent secret programs, to ensure that countries give up the material that they could use to build a nuclear bomb to an international organization like the United Nations, to ensure that everybody's being honest. I want to note, lastly, the role of counterplans on this topic. So there are a variety of reforms that the negative could adopt to make nuclear weapons less scary. So there are no first use policies, or NFU, where countries could agree that they would never use nuclear weapons first. I think that this only has limited value in a scenario where you're debating an affirmative that's only about the United States, or only about Israel, or only about NATO countries, or about China, Russia, etc., because I think that if every country agreed to a no first use policy, there'd be no need to have nuclear weapons anymore, because what's the point if nobody could at all contemplate using them first, which would basically lead to global disarmament. You could have all countries ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which would be an effective counter to affirmatives that just focus on the consequences of nuclear testing. You could establish nuclear weapons-free zones. So for an affirmative that focuses on India and Pakistan, you could say that India and Pakistan should agree that the Kashmir region will be a nuclear weapons-free zone, which means that they'll have a binding process where a third-party arbiter will make sure that both countries are following that agreement, and ultimately means that you have fiated away that nuclear war scenario within that particular region, and it'd be incumbent on the affirmative to argue why India and Pakistan may still go to nuclear war despite the Kashmir question being off the table, or that they would break that agreement. That's similar to a counterplan that would establish arms limitations, just as the United States and Russia have spent decades agreeing to limits on each other's nuclear arsenals, including under the Obama administration with New START, but also if you look at the SALT treaties, like SALT and SALT II under prior U.S. administrations during the Cold War. So if you think about how scary it is that the U.S. and Russia each have over 6,000 nuclear weapons, they had a lot more at the height of the Cold War and have whittled that down. So the negative could argue that doing that achieves the best of both worlds by achieving stability without abolishing nuclear weapons. But the affirmative can argue that as long as nuclear weapons still exist, the inherent problems with them will still remain. And that's why, as the affirmative, you should always be writing positions that can account for these sneaky negative counterplans that can establish limitations to the nuclear status quo, yet fail to resolve overall problems with it. That's important as well because you can't say that countries will violate the agreements of the counterplan because that might undercut your own affirmative position about a global agreement for nuclear disarmament. So it's important for both affirmative and negative to be strategic about the way that they are writing their affirmatives to account for these common negative positions. But also, as the negative, when you read these counterplans, you really want to make sure that you don't undercut your own position about deterrence, for example, because there is literature that says that if you adopt a no first use policy, that undermines the credibility of a country's nuclear deterrent. So you may have to bite the bullet, so to speak, and say that even though countries have the option of threatening to use nuclear weapons first, that threat is actually credible and achieves the peace long term. So there are also a variety of other moral frameworks I didn't get to mention that matter for this topic. I did briefly mention just war theory, but that has to do with principles of proportionality and of discrimination. So the idea that nuclear weapons are wildly out of proportion with the initial aggression that they're responding to, or with the principle of discrimination. Again, you'd be killing a lot of innocent non-combatants. Additionally, John Rawls has written a little bit about nuclear weapons, arguing that liberal democracies need to possess them in order to discourage outlaw states that violate human rights from engaging in aggression and undermining the international rules of the road, such as North Korea. Even though he had written long before North Korea acquired a nuclear weapons program, but that's a good contemporary example. And then there's also some discussion about contractarianism as it relates to nuclear deterrence. So the idea that morality is about creating mutually beneficial rules between self-interested agents, and that nuclear deterrent threats are permissible because if a country were to ever use nuclear weapons first, or to even so far as threaten that, then they have refused to play by mutually beneficial rules, which means that even though the threat to use nuclear weapons is traditionally immoral, it would be permissible in that situation where there's kind of an anarchic environment where a state has abrogated the norms of peace. So there's so much to talk about with this topic, and there is a voluminous literature about nuclear weapons that our brief at Champion Briefs has excellently covered. I encourage you to check it out. Again, this is Adam Tomasi signing off, but this was the January-February LD 2020 topic analysis, and good luck with all of your debates.